It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Gigabyte M27U. As usual, there is a full written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support. As usual, remember that what you see in the video depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what the monitor would look like in person. This monitor uses a 27-inch AU Optronics AHV, that's an IPS type panel, and it has a 3840 by 2160 4K UHD resolution and support for 160Hz refresh rate. So you've got really good desktop real estate potential. You will be able to see how small my desktop icons are, and just UI elements and text in general is very small because of this resolution if you're not using scaling. I'm not using any scaling at the moment. I'm actually used to using monitors of this kind of pixel density natively without scaling, so I can benefit from the full desktop real estate. However, you might want to use a bit of scaling. Whether you're using scaling or not, most applications do scale cleanly these days. So if you're using scaling or application-specific zoom, so you just zoom in a bit when you're browsing the internet or doing word processing, then you still benefit from the strong pixel density. Things scale cleanly, things are just larger, but they're still very clear with nice crisp edges. So yes, the overall crispness, the clarity of text is really nice. It also applies to suitably high-resolution image content, and that would also apply to games and movies, certainly games. And I explore this a little bit more in the written review in the 4K UHD experience section there. There's also an article on the website exploring the 4K UHD experience on a screen of a similar size to this one. From the front you can see a similar design to other Gigabyte M series models, so lots of matte black plastic. There's actually a little glossy black section there in the middle of the stand. I'm not really a fan of this fingerprint magnet, dust magnet, glossy black plastic, but it's only used sparingly here, so I'm not too bothered. The monitor has quite a compact design as well. Actually, the stand isn't particularly deep, and the screen goes reasonably far back from the front edge as well. So you can put it reasonably close to the wall, and if you don't have a particularly deep desk, that's a good thing. You can see the bottom bezel, matte black plastic with a medium or light grey Gigabyte logo for a little bit of contrast. The top and side bezels use a dual stage design, so that means there's a slim panel border flush with the rest of the screen. Difficult to see when the screen's switched off as it is now. When there's an image displaying, as you can see elsewhere in the review, you can see that panel border more clearly. And then there's a thin, hard plastic outer part as well. The M27U has what I would classify as a light to very light matte anti-glare screen surface. So this means that in terms of glare handling, it's pretty good, but not as strong as some matte screen surfaces. So you can see sharper, sort of glassy looking glare patches when you've got strong direct light striking the screen surface, as I do in this example here. But on the plus side, you don't get as much diffusion of the light, so it doesn't diffuse and haze up the image as much. And the light to very light matte finish also means there's not as much layering in front of the image, so it improves the clarity and vibrancy potential as well. At the rear you can see more of that glossy black plastic at the top, but most of the rear is matte black plastic. There's a cable tidy loop towards the bottom of the stand neck. The included stand attaches using a quick release mechanism, so you can just push that catch up and quickly release the screen from the stand. Included stand offers height and tilt adjustment, so not full ergonomic flexibility, although for most people tilt and height will be enough. So the OSD controls and the dedicated KVM button, that's all explored in the dedicated OSD video. A bit more glossy black plastic for those diagonal sections there. The ports face downwards, so there's an AC power input. The monitor has an internal power converter rather than an external power brick. There are two HDMI 2.1 ports. There's DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC and also HBR3, although many models actually support HBR3 and it's not specifically advertised, but Gigabyte does choose to specifically advertise it here. There's USB-C, and that has DisplayPort Alt mode. It has 18 watts of power delivery and it has upstream capability for upstream data. There's a 3.5mm headphone jack. There are three USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports and also a USB Type B port or USB B port. So with the two USB upstream ports, that's how you get the KVM functionality, which allows you to quickly switch between displays and assign peripherals to different systems quickly that are connected to the monitor. I'd like to talk briefly about the capability to the ports as well. So with DisplayPort 1.4, you have up to 160Hz. That's using a little factory overclock feature. Otherwise it's going to be running at 150 Hz maximum. Very little difference between the two. It doesn't always work on all systems, the little factory overclock, but don't be feeling too hard done by if it doesn't work on your system, because that extra 10 Hz makes very little difference. And via HDMI 2.1, you have a maximum of 150 Hz. And if you're using a compatible games console with HDMI 2.1, you get up to 120 Hz. And this is all with the native 4K UHD resolution. There's also VRR support, so you've got Adaptive-Sync via HDMI and DisplayPort, and you've got HDMI 2.1 VRR, so a wide range of VRR connectivity there. So that allows you to use AMD FreeSync, it allows you to use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, it allows you to use HDMI 2.1 VRR without Adaptive-Sync as well, so lots of possibilities. The monitor also supports HDR at the same time as all of this. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This monitor has a contrast ratio of around 1000 to 1. That's what I recorded under my test settings and with most other settings on the monitor for that matter. So this is in line with specifications and it's pretty average for an IPS type panel really. And as an IPS type panel, contrast is not its main strength. There's also IPS glow to consider. You see that mainly as a cool haze towards the bottom corners of the screen from a normal viewing position. The camera's mounted a bit more centrally than you might have your eyes, so you can see it a bit further up as well, and it tends to take on a little bit of a warm tint up there. Depending on how you're sitting and how close you are to the monitor, you may notice it a bit further up as well. But this eats away at the detail and atmosphere, particularly for darker scenes like this. It's also something which is brought out more strongly if you're sitting closer to the monitor, if you're using a higher brightness, or if your unit has an issue with significant backlight bleed and clouding. The strength of this monitor as an IPS type panel is its strong gamma consistency, and that means that dark shades are represented well throughout the screen. Yes, there is detail loss due to IPS glow, but the representation of a given dark shade, or just shade in general really, is similar whether it's displayed in the centre of the screen or near the edges, unlike on a VA model where you get black crush centrally and you can get excessive detail towards the edges of the screen, even if the monitor is perfectly well calibrated, or with a TN model where there's a vertical gradient of dark detail due to gamma shifts. This monitor is a lot more consistent than that. I've brightened the room up a bit. It isn't super bright, but it's brighter than it was before. And you can see some glare on the screen. It's actually less noticeable to the eye than it appears in the video. But depending on your lighting conditions, that's certainly something you may get a bit of on the screen. But also with these brighter conditions, the IPS glow and the weaknesses in the static contrast are just less apparent than when you're sitting in a dark room as I was before. If you do find yourself sitting in a dark room, or you prefer to sit in a mainly dark room or dimmer environment, then I would recommend some bias lighting or some lighting behind the monitor, as that can aid perceived contrast. It can also help with viewing comfort. Looking now at the brighter shades, the screen surface has a bit of a graininess to it, but it's not a strong, heavy or smeary graininess. There's not a lot of obvious layering in front of the image or anything like that. It's more of a light, what I describe as misty graininess perhaps. And as far as 4K UHD models of this kind of size go, I'd say this is a pretty decent screen surface really. It's going to be something which most people are going to be absolutely fine with. I'm now going to explore the colour reproduction of the monitor, and to start off I like to use Lagom, lagom.nl, the website, and the test for viewing angles there. So the Lagom text, that would ideally appear a blended grey throughout the screen. It does appear quite blended here, but it has a bit of a blue tint to it. Actually, it has a little bit of a red quality to it towards the bottom of the screen and more so the bottom right. But it doesn't have obvious shifts in saturation between saturated green, red, orange, like you would get on VA or TN models. This block, I'm afraid, always looks completely weird on the video, but to my eye it's a consistent pinkish purple throughout the screen. It does appear with a slightly stronger pink tint lower down the screen and towards the side edges from normal viewing position, but this is a minor shift. It's far more minor than you'd see on a VA model or TN model, and actually some IPS models show a bit more of a shift than this as well. The red block, that's a nice consistent rich red throughout the screen, a little bit darker towards the extreme edges, but I do stress a little bit. Some IPS models actually show this a bit more strongly, and certainly VA models have more significant shifts for this shade. The green block, that appears a good rich yellowish green chartreuse throughout the screen, very slightly brighter towards the edges, but it's only a minor thing, and it's something which I can observe further back. It's not related to viewing angles, it's actually the bezel design, the dual stage bezel design, very common on monitors, not something I'd worry about. The blue block, good royal blue throughout the screen. I'm now on Battlefield 2042, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. Most content you consume on a monitor when you're gaming under SDR, watching movies under SDR, you're just on a desktop. It's designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, and if you're using a gamut on the monitor which is wider than that, you get extra vibrancy and extra saturation. You can see on the screen the measured gamut for this monitor. I measured 91% DCI-P3, so there's quite a bit of extension beyond sRGB, although this does fall a bit short of the 95% DCI-P3 which is specified by the manufacturer. There can be a bit of variation between units and also depending on the colorimeter and the software used to measure, but even then I think that the 95% DCI-P3 is a bit ambitious for this one. You can see extension in the red region, also for the green to blue edge, and in the blue region there's a bit of a kink, a bit of an interesting skew, so a bit of overextension in the blues, and also some underextension, so there's actually 99% sRGB for that reason. So it doesn't completely cover sRGB, there are some saturated blue shades which it isn't displaying. It's not something that you're going to find noticeable or bothersome just with general usage, and even if you're calibrating the monitor and doing image editing, ideally it would have 100% sRGB and it wouldn't have that weird kink in the blue region of the gamut, but again, it's not a huge issue either way. So what this means is the overall representation is vibrant, so those sky blues there have more pop to them. The greens there, they stand out quite nicely, and some of the greens have a bit too much of a bright or yellowish green quality. They stand out a bit too much, although not to the extent of models with an even wider gamut and in particular stronger Adobe RGB coverage. And if you're interested, by the way, I measured 87% Adobe RGB on this one. The reds stand out nicely as well. Pretty generous gamut in the red region, so the red painted doors and the side of the wall there stands out nicely. Also fires on this game stand out nicely with some rich oranges and reds, although there are some yellows which verge a bit too much on orange, oranges a bit too much on red, that kind of thing, but it's still, it's eye-catching, it's vibrant. And there's also a bit of a push to some of these earthy browns. They have a bit too much of an orange or red quality to them, a bit more than they should. They don't look quite as neutral as they should. And you can see that with skin tones as well, but it's not an extreme push. I wouldn't say skin tones look completely off like they can on some monitors with an even wider gamut than this. If you prefer to have things more as the developers intend, more toned down, then there's an sRGB emulation setting on this monitor, and that will clamp the gamut closer to sRGB. So just change the picture mode over to sRGB. And you can probably see that the image is less saturated even in the video. Of course you can't see the exact nature of the change, but you should have been able to see that there is a change now with lower saturation overall. That is what you observe by eye as well. So it gets rid of the oversaturation, more muted, more toned down. This isn't a perfect sRGB emulation setting. You can adjust the brightness, which is nice. You can't adjust the colour channels, although mine were quite well balanced actually on my unit. You can't adjust the gamma either. And gamma was a bit quirky, although it was a little bit quirky actually regardless of whether you're using the sRGB setting or not. That's all explored more in the vision review, but for general purpose use I wouldn't worry about this. It's not massively off. And I do explore the sRGB setting more in terms of colour accuracy as well in the vision review. And I would say in that respect it isn't amazing, it's not the best sRGB setting I've seen, but it's not the worst either. It's perfectly usable if you need it. Another thing is that it does lock off the overdrive control and it sets that to off, which is an odd restriction. If you don't like these restrictions and you've got an NVIDIA or AMD dedicated GPU, you're a desktop user, then you can use alternatives in the graphics driver or using a little tool, and that's all explored in the colour reproduction section of the written review and in an article all about sRGB emulation on the website. Just switched back over to my test settings just to reinforce the visual comparison a little bit. So if you're using this monitor for colour critical work or colour accurate work, image editing, etc., where you do value strong colour accuracy, you have to be aware of the gamut. You're not going to be able to do accurate work within the Adobe RGB space. 87% coverage isn't good enough for that. Within the DCI-P3 space, 91% isn't really good enough for that. It's not ideal anyway. I mean, it's passable, but it's not ideal. And again, as I said, it's not a perfect sRGB emulation mode. Either way, I would recommend, if you can and you value colour accuracy, calibrate it, using your own colorimeter or similar device. That's going to get the most out of the monitor, but you're still going to have a little bit of sRGB under coverage, but it's only a little bit. It isn't something I would be overly concerned about. I'm now going to look at the HDR performance of the monitor, and I'm on the desktop just for now so I can show you how the local dimming solution of this monitor works. It is VESA DisplayHDR 600 certified, this one, and that does require some degree of local dimming, which this monitor does offer, but it's very basic. It only has 8 dimming zones, and they're arranged as vertical bands running down the screen. So the whole of that vertical band dims or brightens at the same time, as you can see with this nice little demonstration here, and there's a link to this in the description of the video, this specific local dimming test if you want to see it for yourself. It's fairly reactive. I'm using the high local dimming setting. You can adjust this, but I would recommend high. It's actually a bit more gradual for larger bright objects such as this blob here. You might be able to see there's more of a trail, more of a gradual fade out when it moves, even when it's moved right across the screen. I know it can be a little bit tricky to see, but you get the idea. Basic local dimming solution. Just gives you a situational edge in contrast, and it doesn't completely shut off the zones which are not in use, and that's even when it's trying to display pure black as it is here. Most content that which you display in games is going to be mixed. It's going to have lots of different shade brightnesses, so you're not going to get amazing depth or anything like that, but it just gives you an edge compared to with the local dimming solution disabled, and I will just show you that quickly for comparison. So it's in picture HDR local dimming, or HDR game, HDR movie. 3 HDR settings on this monitor. They're exactly the same, but there are just some different settings which you can apply differently in each preset if you want. So you've got 3 different presets you can use for different applications, whatever you might want to do. These are all explored in the OSD video and the test settings video, by the way, if you're curious, because I'm not going to go through them here. But this is with local dimming off, so you can see that it just stays at a high brightness throughout the screen, makes the IPS glow a lot more noticeable, and for the dark regions, the massive uplift in terms of the shade depth, so it's not as dark as it should be. And I've just set the local dimming to low. So it's quite reactive, but this is, you can't really see the differences between the different local dimming settings so well in this particular test. But basically it will be more reluctant to dim down as much. That's the main difference I notice. It sometimes doesn't brighten up as much either. So the zones aren't really quite as reactive as what I'm trying to say. And it's explored more in the written review, but if you prefer a gentler approach to the dimming, you're finding the high setting too much, then consider medium or low. And actually this larger blob here is probably a better demonstration because the depth is still quite high there. I'm just going to pause the video and show you the different settings. So that's low. That's middle. Don't know if you can see in the video, but it has improved the depth. And that's high, which has very slightly improved the depth. Actually, medium or middle and high are reasonably similar. I think low is really more distinct from those two. Back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I'm running the game under HDR now. And I'm using an RTX 3090 connected via DisplayPort. I did test with HDMI 2.1 and it was a similar experience. You may have noticed in the section video I showed you before with the local dimming test, there were some other settings associated with HDR, but I've got that all at default. And if you're interested in these settings, I explore them in the best settings video or the OSD video as well, which the best settings video is just really part of. And they do let you tweak the image if you like to do that under HDR, but I prefer how things look by default, so that's what I'm going to stick to. And I'm really more interested in the overall capabilities of the monitor on the hardware side, which is not dictated by some little settings you'll adjust. So this monitor is VESA DisplayHDR 600 certified, which I may have mentioned earlier. So that's a reasonable level of HDR you can expect just based on the certification, but of course that doesn't really tell you an awful lot about the performance, except for the fact that it does have local dimming, which I've shown you, and that it should reach around 600 nits of peak luminance or slightly exceed that. But if you're interested in some further readings, then check out the written review. So the daylight there, it's quite bright. The monitor's not trying to pump out its maximum luminance because this is sort of passive illumination. The game is not going for maximum brightness there, but it's still a bit more subdued than I might expect. Because if you consider the vertical dimming zones, you've got a darker area there, darker and medium shades, the brighter shades higher up, and it can't just brighten that dimming zone up to the maximum. If it did, then it would really affect the depth of the dark shade. So it sort of compromises and it reaches a middle ground really, where the darker shades are actually less deep than they should be, so there's less atmosphere, it's a term I like to use, and the brightness isn't as bright as it could be, but it does compromise. And further over, where it's showing just darker and medium shades, the depth is better, but even then, it really is an intricate mixture of medium and dark shades. Ideally, you'd have better precision for the illumination, and that would give really nice depth to the dark areas and just help the medium shades stand out a bit more and actually add a bit of depth to some of these medium dark shades as well. So yes, very limited dimming precision with only 8 zones, several million pixels on this monitor, so 8 zones is a tiny number. It just does give that situational edge and contrast. And just to demonstrate this, I'm going to turn the local dimming solution off. So now things look completely flooded. You can instantly see that IPS glow brought out, and I can see that very clearly to my eye. There's just an obvious haziness. There's a lack of depth to the darker shades. The bright shades are slightly brighter now, actually, but the contrast isn't there. The whole screen is brighter. It's just universally illuminated to a bright level, regardless of the shades being displayed, and the whole screen doing it at once, with the backlight controlled as a single unit. So back to my preferred high local dimming setting, certainly does make a positive difference, even with just 8 dimming zones. Under HDR you also get 10-bit colour processing, and that allows for an enhanced variety of shades. It allows the monitor to put its gamut to good use as well, and I'll come on to that a little bit later on. But it gives a greater variety of subtle shade distinctions. Basically it helps give a little bit of an uplift, a natural looking uplift to darker areas, unlike a gamma enhancement under SDR, which just starts giving a flooded look. But to really accentuate this, you would have better dimming precision than is offered here. And it's the same with the brighter shades. The 10-bit colour reproduction helps there. It gives you smoother gradients, more natural progressions of shades. So for the mist over the water here and the light rays, that kind of thing. Some pretty smooth gradients, but again, the dimming precision isn't there to really have very bright shades, somewhat dimmer shades, etc., all displayed together. So it's only part of the equation which this monitor gets right. And yes, it doesn't look like a giant ball of light, it's a bit more like that to the eye, but again, you can't appreciate how things would really look on this monitor unless you see it in person. Now if I look at this scene, and I consider the brightness of the glint on the water surface, for example, again, that isn't supposed to be the maximum brightness of the monitor because that's not what the game is going for, but even so, it should be brighter than is shown here. I measured 245 nits, so really it's not anywhere near as bright as it should be. With local dimming off, it does brighten up significantly. It's now 460 nits I measured. So again, not quite the maximum of the monitor, but it shouldn't be quite at the maximum of the monitor. That's not what the game is going for. But if you look at the rest of the image, I'm not sure if this will be clear on the video, but clear to my eye that there's a distinct lack of depth, even over there where there are lots of dark and medium shades. It's just uplifted, has a foggy look. It's not nice at all. And then with local dimming set to high, it does improve that. It's not incredible because again, you've got very limited dimming precision, and yes, the little shadowy details around the vegetation and the rock cracks should be deeper than they are, and there should be more depth to a lot of these medium shades than there is, but even so, there is some situational improvement. I also talked a little bit about the reactivity of the dimming zones in the section of the video earlier when I was showing the local dimming test. I would say that in general, I don't find the local dimming solution distracting on most scenes. I'm not really too aware of it doing its thing, but it does depend on the scene. There are certainly some scenes where it can be more noticeable. There's a lot of dark content and smaller bright shades moving across the screen, for example, and certainly you can be aware of the illumination and the dimming of the zones. I'd just like to show you this scene again because it's the one I showed you when I was talking about contrast. You can see that, there's IPS glow, there's a mixture of shades here, lots of different shade depths, and the dimming precision really is just too limited to deliver the kind of look that's expected in this scene. Having said that, it does still help, so I'm just going to sort of let the camera and everything stabilise, and then I'm going to turn the local dimming solution off just so you can see what it would look like without it. It just looks extremely flooded now, more so than it did before. The brightness in the middle there, it is brighter, because it's not trying to dim down at all. The torch there does stand out more, or at least it's brighter, but the contrast really isn't there. There's just a foggy look. Local dimming back to high doesn't perform miracles by any means. This scene does not look as it can under HDR at all, but it's still an improvement. I'm now on Battlefield 5 running the game under HDR just so I can show you this scene. This is a scene which does have a mixture of shades, but there's quite a lot of bright dominance with the shades. And This is a scene which OLED monitors will struggle with because they have an ABL automatic brightness limiter that kicks in when there's this much bright shade on the screen at once. This monitor doesn't have an automatic brightness limiter behavior or anything like that. And the sun here is nice and bright, nice and eye-catching. The game is going for that. It really does want to pump out really strong luminance. And it's not extreme in this case. It's not 1000 nits plus, as some monitors can provide here. However, I recorded 557 nits, so that's actually quite close to the maximum which I recorded on this monitor. So it definitely stands out nicely. What I would say though is, again, because it doesn't have extreme luminance and it doesn't have extreme luminance precision, you don't get this same look that you should get with the glint of light down here, for example. It isn't as well defined as it should be. There should be a nice array of brighter shades and medium shades, and that's kind of lost a bit here. I'm on another scene on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again running HDR, and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction now, another important aspect of HDR. So under HDR, the developers can target DCI-P3 or Rec 2020, a massive gamut, and as you can see on the screen here, just as a reminder, you get 91% DCI-P3 coverage on this monitor. So it's not an amazing gamut for HDR content, but it's reasonable. And I would say the monitor puts it to pretty good use as well. So things don't look super vibrant, but they look reasonably rich, and there's a nice array of greens without the kind of yellowish green push that I observed under SDR. Perhaps some of the shades do look a little bit more muted than they could, but I think that is actually partly down to the lack of dimming precision as well. As I was talking about before, that does just naturally add extra depth if you have improved dimming precision. It's all linked together under HDR, the tone mapping and the luminance levels, the relative shade depths. And those blue flowers there certainly aren't as eye-catching as I've seen on some models, but they still have a nice pop to them and they stand out quite well even if I'm not specifically looking for them. So a decent amount of vibrancy, and they don't look kind of white like they do on the screen, and that's because the brightness is just a little bit too high. Looks a bit more like that, but unfortunately you can't see on the video what it will look like to the eye. And if I look at Lara's skin, as I mentioned with the green shades, they're a bit overdone under SDR. Lara's skin is as well, and it looked a little bit too tanned, whereas under HDR it's toned down because they're not targeting sRGB. There's not the oversaturation now, that's not an issue. The fire as well, that is toned down, although this particular fire is not a very good example because it's quite a whitish yellow with sort of pale orange even under SDR, but just in general the fires on this game and other games, they're a bit overdone under SDR and they're toned down under HDR, but there are still some really nice licks of vibrancy. So I'd say that overall, when you look at the whole package under HDR, it certainly isn't as impressive as some models under HDR, and I would not buy this monitor for its HDR performance, but it does still offer some benefits in terms of the somewhat higher luminance than some models will provide. Decent colour gamut because some HDR capable monitors will barely cover sRGB, so this one certainly does better than that. And it can just give you a bit of variety using HDR every now and then, and on this monitor I think it's something which you might want to explore using now and then. I'm back on Battlefield 5. I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. The monitor is running in SDR, just in case you're wondering. You can see my frame rate towards the top right, or you might not be able to see because it's a tiny little green number, but it's 160. So this is a 160 Hz monitor. I've got the game running at a good solid 160 frames a second. So this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination gives you some advantages. It greatly improves the connected feel, and that describes the fluidity and the precision you feel when you're interacting with the game. If you compare this to a 60 Hz monitor, there's a massive difference. If you compare this to 120 Hz even, there's a bit of a difference. It also decreases the perceived blur due to eye movement. So perceived blur is a concept explored in an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness, and it's summarised a bit in the written review in the responsiveness section. But basically, most of the perceived blur you observe on a monitor is linked to your eye movement and linked to the refresh rate of the display at a matching frame rate. The other aspect of perceived blur is pixel responsiveness, but just before I go into some pursuit photographs, if you're not familiar, pursuit photography is explored a bit in that article I mentioned and summarised in the written review. But just before that, I have to mention input lag, but that also affects the connected feel, which I was talking about just before. And on this model, it's pretty low. Well, it's low. It's under 4 milliseconds. So it's not super low, but It does indicate a low signal delay, which most users will be perfectly happy with. And remember that signal delay is the main element of input lag you feel. So with a low signal delay and a good high frame rate, high refresh rate combination and a decent frame rate and refresh rate, certainly gives you a nice level of connected feel. So back to those pixel responses and pursuit photography now. Here are some pursuit photographs on the screen using Blurbuster's Test UFO. Has various different overdrive settings, this monitor, off picture quality, balance and speed. There's also a smart OD setting, which is anything but smart. It really just has the overdrive set to a higher level than I'd like throughout the refresh rate range, so it's not a useful setting in my view. If you look at the vision review, there are also some pursuit photographs at various lower refresh rates than 160, and also a comparison with the 28-inch models I've reviewed with the Inlux panel. So the XV282KKV is used as an example there, and that's a good fast monitor, compared at 144Hz and a few lower refresh rates. It doesn't run at 160Hz, which is why it's not used in this comparison here. I have to mention as well, although this is a 160Hz monitor with an overclock, so you set something called DP refresh rate in the OSD, you have to actually adjust that from the default of 150 to 160Hz. And you might find that you get some signal issues, screen blanking, or perhaps out of range issues with this. Then just stick to 150Hz, wider compatibility. 160 doesn't necessarily work with all graphics cards, and really don't feel hard done by 150 versus 160Hz. There is very little difference. The 10Hz makes very little difference. Anyway, back to these pursuit photographs. I would recommend picture quality as the optimal setting here, although some may like to use balance if they're not too sensitive to overshoot, although it doesn't look too bad here. There were some brighter halo trailing examples that are significantly brighter than the background and stood out for that reason in practice, looking at a broader range of transitions than are shown here. But even with the transitions shown here, you can see that the speed setting really has strong overshoot and is not something which I'd recommend using, and it's not something which most people are going to want to use. Picture quality setting though, this is a decent performance level there. A little bit of powdery trailing behind the UFOs, nothing too distracting, nothing like VA smeary trailing, and also some IPS models have more distinct heavy powdery trailing, as I'd call it, than this. And there's a nice boost going from off to picture quality as well, it's worth noting. So this is something which is really observed more broadly with a broader range of transitions. So this specific scene here, it's really representative of many sort of brighter or daylight scenes you'll see in this game, and more broadly in that it has a mixture of transitions, but it's mainly medium to brighter shades with a few dark shades mixed in. I mean, yes, it's not giving you sort of 160Hz OLED level clarity or anything like that with the pretty much instantaneous pixel responses. A little bit of powdery trailing in places, but again, I stress it's a little bit. It's not something that stands out in a horrible way or anything like that. It's a really sort of a minor contributor to perceived blur here. Still a pretty fast monitor. Isn't quite as fast as the 28-inch models I mentioned before in terms of its pixel responses, but I don't think it makes a massive difference even if you were using them side by side. I think the main difference most people would pick up on is actually that the 28-inch models have a bit more overshoot than this model does using its picture quality setting. And really in the way of overshoot, there's nothing to complain about, just a little bit here and there, some traces, doesn't stand out, isn't something I'd worry about. On another scene on Battlefield 5, and this one has a greater variety of high contrast transitions, so there are more dark shades in the mix, but often with contrasting backgrounds as well. And this can highlight some of the weaker transitions. So the weakest transitions this monitor performs, they are where dark shades or very bright or strongly saturated shades are involved. And even here, again, no massive weaknesses, just a bit of powdery trailing, as I like to call it in places. Just adds a little bit of a mask of perceived blur overall, but nothing dramatic. And really nothing to complain about in this scene either in the way of overshoot. And just more broadly, I've observed this monitor with a range of games and range of scenes, and it really, with the picture quality setting, it is very much a low overshoot experience. The monitor also supports VRR, variable refresh rate technology, and you can use that with Adaptive-Sync using AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, and that's what I'm using at the moment. I've got an RTX 3090 hooked up via DisplayPort, and you can also use FreeSync via HDMI with a compatible graphics card or compatible games console such as the Xbox Series X. The monitor also supports HDMI 2.1 VRR, and that means you can use VRR on compatible games consoles, including the PS5. You can also use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via HDMI 2.1. I did test G-Sync compatible via HDMI as well as DisplayPort, very similar experience on both. You can also use HDR at the same time as VRR if you wish, that's not a problem on this monitor. And overall, VRR does its thing, it gets rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches, works well. Didn't have any annoying issues with flickering or anything like that. I appreciate that this isn't officially G-Sync compatible certified. It likely would pass the certification, I don't see any reason it wouldn't if Gigabyte decided to make it go through that process, but they've gone for AMD FreeSync Premium Pro certification instead. But don't worry too much about these certifications, the end result and the experience here is just fine. I've now got the game running at 120 frames a second, and the monitor is responding by running at 120 Hz because I'm using VRR. There is a bit of an increase in overshoot now, but nothing strong or eye-catching. Of course, sensitivity to overshoot varies, so perhaps you would find it slightly eye-catching if you're particularly sensitive to overshoot, but honestly I think it's absolutely fine here. There is a decrease in connected feel and an increase in perceived blur just because of the lower frame rate. That isn't something which VRR can fix. 80 Hz, 80 frames a second now. Further increase in overshoot. And at this point, and just in general, if you're in the double digits a lot of the time, you might want to consider the off setting, which will get rid of the overshoot, but it does slow down the pixel transitions a bit. However, I do feel that with these relatively low refresh rates, double digit refresh rates, the pixel responses, even with the off setting, are quite decent, so you're not going to get a terrible experience either way. 60 Hz, 60 frames a second now, further increase in overshoot. You might even be able to see it in the video now. Even here, it's not extreme overshoot, but there are some eye-catching, or fairly eye-catching, halo trail examples. But again, you can use the offsetting if that's distracting you and you want to, and you're spending a lot of time in a particular game down here with your frame rates and refresh rates. But some people might just like to stick with picture quality all the way, so they could consider it a single overdrive mode experience if that's okay for them. But I do like the offsetting being an option, because if I think about the 28-inch models I've looked at, the Acer XV282KKV and the Asus VG28UQL1A, I think. It's hard to remember these model codes sometimes. I've got a lot of these swimming around in my head. And it will also apply to the Gigabyte M28U. They don't actually have an overdrive setting which will help with the overshoot at lower refresh rates. So there's always a bit of overshoot and quite a bit of overshoot, a moderate amount at lower refresh rates, regardless of the overdrive setting you select. So the M27U does improve on that. And for me, I feel that's quite important, because some console gamers, or if you don't have a particularly powerful GPU, or you just like to really ramp up the graphics settings, because a 4K UHD resolution is pretty demanding, you might want to just stick to that offsetting and have the low overshoot experience. And that's something you can do here. The VRR range of this one is claimed to be 48 to 160 Hz, and I can confirm that with my testing, although sometimes, and it just depends on the fluctuations occurring, the floor of operation would sometimes be closer to 55 Hz. This is something that I've observed on various monitors, not specific to this one, just an interesting little thing. Doesn't really make much difference to the user, but what you have to be aware of is that when the LFC boundary, as AMD would call it, low frame rate compensation, is crossed, then the monitor will stick to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay, and that does work well, but there is a bit of a crossover point, and there's subtle momentary stuttering when it crosses over in either direction. That is not specific to this monitor, it's something I always observe. And generally it's not going to be a problem. It's not as obvious as the stuttering you would get normally without VRR, and you don't get tearing introduced or anything like that. But if you are sensitive to this and you're frequently passing that boundary, then it is something to be aware of, and potentially bothersome. Speaking of potentially bothersome, this monitor has a strobe backlight setting called Aim Stabilizer Sync. I wasn't able to get this to work reliably under VRR, and I explore this in the written review, and that's really a better format for exploring strobe backlight settings like this. There are some pursuit photographs as well if you're interested in some visuals. Basically, I would say that it's usable. Some people might like this, but it locks the brightness at a moderately high setting. The monitor uses KSF phosphors, and there are flickering and fringing issues as a result, which are very apparent to sensitive users like me. when you're using strobe backlight settings, and I find it really annoying and distracting beyond the normal flickering you get with a strobe backlight setting. And it's not really perfectly tuned in terms of its overshoot levels or strobe crosstalk levels, but it's not terrible in that respect. So it's just a little bit messy, a bit artifacty really, and I don't really consider it an amazing implementation, but it's not terrible. So some people might still see some utility in it. To wrap up then, quite a basic design similar to other Gigabyte M series models, quite plasticky black plastics, used extensively, including for the stand base, although it is weighted so it doesn't sort of wobble around all over the place. I personally prefer coated metal stands, gives just a bit of a premium look and feel to things, in my opinion. In terms of ergonomics, more limited than some options because you can't pivot it, you can't swivel it left or right, but you can tilt it and you can adjust the height of the screen. So they're really the main adjustments people are generally interested in. And if you want further ergonomic flexibility, there's provision for VESA 100 mounting. The contrast performance very much in line with my expectations, close to the 1000:1 specified. The IPS glow was at an expected level for this size of panel and the panel type, perhaps slightly lower than average, but really quite a typical experience. I found the screen surface pretty agreeable as well. Light to very light matte anti-glare with a reasonably smooth finish, so not super grainy or layered or anything like that. Most people are going to be absolutely perfectly happy with this aspect. The colour reproduction, it doesn't have true wide gamut support, so it doesn't really cover enough of DCI-P3 and certainly not Adobe RGB to be considered in that way. But it still offers a boost compared to sRGB, a boost in vibrancy and saturation, which some people are going to appreciate. Strong colour consistency from the IPS type panel as well, which is nice. And an sRGB emulation mode with adjustable brightness does the trick if you want a more toned down as the developers intend look. The HDR performance of the monitor, well, it does lift itself above average, but that's not really saying much. The average HDR performance on a monitor is really quite dismal. So at least this one has a reasonable colour gamut, which was put to pretty good use really, and it has 8-zone local dimming and a peak brightness of around 600 nits. So again, a bit more than some monitors offer, but by no means a super compelling HDR experience. Good responsiveness as well, a good 160 or 150 Hz performance depending on what you're able or wanting to use, with the 10 Hz making really very little difference in practice, but it looks nice on paper. Good flexibility with the pixel responses, and I feel a well-tuned picture quality setting, which offers the kind of experience most are going to be very happy with. Low input lag thrown into the mix, good VRR support as well, with HDMI 2.1 VRR, as well as Adaptive-Sync support. The monitor also has USB-C ports with DisplayPort Alt Mode capability and somewhat limited power delivery, 18 watts, but still can use it if you need to. And also KVM functionality, it has multiple USB upstream ports, so that's the nice addition which some people can make use of. So as an overall package, and considering the price of this monitor, which sits at $550 as its normal price, but it's sometimes on sale for a bit less than that, I feel that it does offer a lot of monitor for the money, and it is one that I can recommend. I also feel that it does offer something a bit above the 28-inch competing models for a similar price, such as the Gigabyte M27U. I know the HDR isn't incredible, but it still lifts itself just a little bit above that level because of the improved brightness capability. I also like the fact that it gives you a low overshoot experience if you want it, regardless of refresh rate. So it is certainly a monitor I can recommend. So that's really all there is to the Gigabyte M27U. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.